Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. As many of us celebrate Thanksgiving this week, our gatherings, they may look a little bit different. Today's guest, Priya Parker, is helping us take a deeper look at how anyone can create collective meaning, one gathering at a time. Priya is the author of The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters, a conflict resolution facilitator, and host of the podcast Together Apart. She studied organizational design at MIT, public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and political and social thought at the University of Virginia. Her work has been featured on the Today Show, Oprah.com, Glamour, and the New York Times. Today, Priya and I talk about the art of gathering. Frustrated by dull, purposeless, and disappointing events, Priya decided to rewrite the rule book. And today she shares how to turn those everyday gatherings into transformative experiences. So if you've ever sat in a meeting and thought, why on earth am I in here? If you've ever hosted a party and wondered, how can I kick this up a notch? Or attended an event and asked yourself, when in the world is this thing gonna end? Then this is a conversation for you. Priya shares what works, what doesn't, and why. At a time when coming together is more important than ever, this conversation will have you reimagining the way that you gather, whether it's in person or virtually, and you'll never be able to look at your next meeting, conference, or dinner party the same way again. Let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Priya Parker. Well, Priya, thanks so much for joining me. This is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you so much for having me. Me too.
This will be fun. All right, so I want to start with your personal background because I think it gives such interesting context to the work that you do. And so maybe can you give our listeners a snapshot of your background, which is broad and robust and amazing. But can you share that real quick?
Absolutely. I'm biracial, and unlike I think a lot of people who perhaps grow up in a household with two different parents who are, come from different cultures or different races. My parents divorced when I was 9, and they each remarried other people. So when I was around 9 years old, my mother's Indian, my father's white American. They, for the first kind of 12 years of their marriage, were sort of each other's sense of adventure. And we lived all over the world. We lived in fishing villages in Africa and Southeast Asia because of their work. And eventually they moved back to the US and we settled in Virginia, and then they separated, and then they divorced. And then within a few years, they had each remarried other people. And I'm their only child, and they had joint custody. And so every 2 weeks, on a Friday afternoon, I would leave one home, and it was and still is Indian, British, Buddhist, vegetarian, theosophist, landmark forum-y, for those of you, if you know what that is,
Sure.
Kind of new agey, Democrat, liberal, progressive household. And I would go to my father and stepmother's home and walk in, and it was and still is a white evangelical Christian, conservative, Republican, twice a week church-going, climate skeptic family. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was my reality for kind of from 9 to 19. And I have always been really interested in when and why and how we come together, and when and why and how we come apart. And I grew up in these two very, very, very different, some could almost say polar opposite households. And my husband often jokes it doesn't take a shrink to explain how I got into the field of conflict resolution. But that's
Sure.
that's kind of my upbringing. And I am a conflict resolution facilitator for groups, and my core work is really looking at when people come together across difference or despite obstacles, how can they meaningfully connect? And that is very much, based on how I was raised and what I navigated.
That's unbelievable. I mean, obviously growing up in that environment, and with those, I would imagine that was like 9 or 10, right? That started for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then evolving into the work that you do, it served you well in the long run, right? Despite what I'm sure was remarkably challenging moments as a 9 and 10 and 11-year-old navigating that level of change.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all deal with, our different versions of rupture pre-COVID, particularly when we used to gather in person. I would every now and then have the experience of a mother or father or a parent come up to me with kind of after a session that I would run with tears in their eyes saying, I'm divorcing my partner. I'm so worried about my children. It's such a tender age,
Mm-hmm.
but you came through it. Do you have any advice about, for me as a parent, as I'm doing what I need to do for me, but it's, tearing apart my family. And what I say to them is, for me, I wouldn't be able to do the work that I'm doing as a facilitator, as somebody who can really understand what it feels like not to belong, were it not for the, that initial rupture in my family. And I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I think for so many of us, our precision, our power at some level, our purpose can come from our pain.
I mean, obviously, you've been trained in group dialogue, conflict resolution, and certainly given your background, I would imagine that gives you a different perspective on gatherings as the title of your book explores. And so I want to dig into that. But how much has that helped you, right, in the work that you do, given your perspective and the uniqueness of that as it relates to the work that you do now with conflict resolution and gatherings?
Growing up, particularly in these two households, one of the things that helped me realize is that the way we do things is made up. And
That's interesting, sure.
And I know that because every 2 weeks I would have two completely different ways to begin a meal, right? Do you pray? Do you start with grace? Do you not start with grace? Do you start with everybody holding hands around a table? Is that really strange? Do you meditate in the morning? Do you, put on whatever, soccer socks or, baseball gloves or, fill in the blank? And I think a huge part of my work and the art of gathering is realizing that the way people do things is a combination of, at some point, meeting a real felt need, but also we inherit ways of being and they don't always make sense. And so a huge part of my work is helping people, communities, workplaces, children, parents, mayors, begin to ask, what is it that my community needs? And how might we gather around that in a way that actually meets their needs versus just repeating what we've always seen be done before?
Mm-hmm. I love how you talk about that. Tell me, why are gatherings at some level so uninspiring and underwhelming, right? You talk about this in the art of gathering. You talk about this so much.
I define a gathering as any time 3 or more people come together for a purpose with a beginning, middle, or end. And so for me, gathering is everything from a wedding to a funeral to a birthday party to a meeting to a protest to a gender reveal party, to mention the news. And one of the reasons why, the biggest mistake we make when we gather is that we assume that the purpose is obvious. You're having a wedding. Why? Right? You could go to City Hall. Why are you specifically bringing a group of people in each of your communities together to witness this event? Or why are we actually having this meeting? Or a birthday party, kind of think like pointy hats and a candle. And rather, we should be first beginning to ask, not what's the form, not what's the most beautiful cake I can have, or how can, what colors are your wedding? And so I think, the biggest mistake we make is that we assume that the form is obvious. And therefore, our gatherings tend to be repetitive. Like, when we all used to go to weddings, they sort of all blend into each other. And or, go to a conference and it's like all of the other conferences. And I started with this question: when you go to a dinner party or a conference or a board meeting and you leave and something has changed inside of you, or a sense of possibility has emerged, or you just remember that one that all the others blend together, and there's this one that was really powerful and magical. Why? Mm-hmm. And for me, the art of gathering was going on this journey and meeting and interviewing and spending time with 100 different gatherers, kind of defined largely of God-optional rabbi, a photographer, a dominatrix, a Olympic hockey coach, and asking them, when you create experiences for groups and it really works, why? And what can the rest of us learn from it?
Right. And you talk about how to make them transformative instead, right? And sort of based on, I'm sure, obviously many of these conversations. So how can people make these more transformative?
When I say transformative, I think often it feels like overwhelming or intimidating. Like
Sure.
I'm just trying to get through the day. Transformative just simply means there's a shift, right? You go to a conference, and because of the way a conversation had at a table, you completely rethink what you could do for your job, right, or for your work.
Sure.
Or you go to a reunion for your high school reunion or your college reunion. And because of the way the host or the school asked the question, it shifted from everyone performing and pretending everything is going great. And actually you had a deeply meaningful, cathartic, powerful conversation with people who had all chosen different, walks of life. And so a couple things. The first is the most likely way to make your gathering, transformative is to first just ask, why am I doing this? And it's a very simple question. What is the purpose of this gathering? What is the need right now? Because the first thing is, if there's not actually a need there, if people aren't actually hungry for what it is that you're offering, it's very difficult for it to have life. And then the second is to then ask, given the need in this community, how might I design this, this experience? I'll give a simple example. A friend of mine this is years ago, was thinking about quitting her job. She was part of one of these companies that was very good at getting people to not quit their job. Right? Okay. Like as soon as someone is about to walk away, so the golden handcuffs, you get a raise or you get a bonus, you get a promotion. And she realized this was happening, and she was really scared to leave. And she came from a family culture where her parents were risk averse and saying, "You sure you want to leave that job?" And she had some friends in her world that were kind of helping keep her in, and others who kept on kind of whispering in her ear, like, "Go, go, go! You can do this." And so she decided to throw herself a quitting party, and she invited 8 people, all people who she considered in her life to be people who took risks, who took courageous risks. And she realized that both fear is contagious, but also courage is contagious. And she invited all of us to come to help to bring something that always gave us courage, a poem or an article of clothing, or it could be anything. And she hosted this quitting party for herself, in part to kick herself out the door,
so cool.
But in part to create a kind of circle of accountability that says, I want to do this. I'm scared. I need you to actually blow courage my way, not fear. Will you hold me accountable to this? And it was beautiful, right? It was beautiful
awesome.
To be asked to attend something that's that real need. It was fun. And it actually helped her create a shift to leave this thing. But also it reinforced for all of us, wow, somebody sees us as courageous. Wow, that crazy decision I made, someone else was watching. Wow, we can shift each other's decisions and each other's kind of norms of what is too much and what is not a big deal. And and she made it up, right? It's not like we don't have quitting parties as
right.
a
normal.
thing in the culture.
Sure.
And so a huge part of creating transformative gatherings is to actually say, what is it that I need, and how can I authentically invite people to come together? Or what is it that you need, right? Or what is it that they need, and how might we gather around this person?
Well, what's amazing, when I read your book, and I do tons of keynote speeches, now mostly virtual, but and different events. And always they lead with, right? It's going to be at the JW in Scottsdale, right? It's going to be at the, right? And so they're sort of going to the logistics, which you talk a lot about, and we'll get to that, versus, hey, the purpose of our gathering is the following, right? We want to bring people in. Here's our theme, and here's the intent, and these are the takeaways we want to have people take mentally, physically, whatever. So I love the sort of shift you take us through in your book, and you talk about 3 key ingredients, right? Can you touch on those real quick when you think about, sort of purpose and gatherings? Can you touch on those 3?
When you start at the beginning of a gathering, just like you were saying, we tend to kind of get the housekeeping out of the way, or what we think is housekeeping, right? Like the coat check is in the back, or even now virtually, make sure your mute button is on. It's kind of like going through this checklist. And at the beginning of any type of gathering, you have this incredible moment actually where no one knows what's actually going to happen. Mm-hmm. And that's a moment of deep power, because the first 5% of any experience tends to lay the track for the rest of it, right? Whether it's how can I behave here? Like, can I show my tattoos? Should I hide my tattoos? Like, should I get a tattoo? Like, who are these people and do I want to belong here? And so the 3, I mean, I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but I think the first is to know the purpose and share it with people. And then the second is to connect them to that purpose. And then the third is to connect them to each other. So I'll give a simple example. I was at a Passover Seder. It was my first one. I'm not Jewish. And I walked into this living room, and there was probably, I don't know, a couple dozen people there. This is pre-COVID, and didn't really know many people. And at like maybe 20 minutes into it, the host kind of dung her glass, and she said, she took a breath and she said, "I'm so happy to have you all here. It means so much to Brian and I that you're here with us for, some of you, what is your 35th Seder with us?" And then you heard like people like, yeah, clapping and looking at each other and hugging. For some of you, it's not only your first Seder with us, it's your first Seder ever. And we welcome you. We are so delighted you are here. And then we all felt welcome. And then for me personally, it's the first Seder without my mother. And so it's a particularly tender one. And I'm so grateful to be surrounded by each of you. And in like 30 seconds, she completely transformed the context and the meaning of the room.
Mm-hmm. So cool. So cool. And pulled everybody in.
Absolutely.
Too, which is so cool.
You are here on purpose. I want you here.
Sure.
If even I need you here, right? I mean, why are we gathering if we don't need each other? Give people their time back.
Sure. Right. Sure. I think about wasteful meetings, right, that we've all been in. And that's actually preventing people from getting work done, right? Wasteful meetings. And so how should leaders be thinking about meetings differently?
I think that COVID in a lot of ways has given from a meeting perspective, a much needed interruption to all of our meetings. And the interruption, if taken, the opportunity to the interruption is to first, if you're a leader or, in any context, to first ask, why are we doing this? What is the need of this meeting? And is it still relevant to the people in it? Mm-hmm. So I often say, don't gather more, gather better. And gather better usually means gathering less.
Sure.
So the first is like, which of these emails could be sufficed through an email? Right? Like just give people their time back. The second is, which of these meetings are we doing out of obligation? And who actually uniquely needs to be there? Right? So another element is to not assume that everybody goes to every meeting. Sizes matter. There's something, a group of 6 versus 12 versus 40 are completely different group dynamics. And so really think about, given the need, what's the purpose and who needs to be there? And we often back into this. So you walk into a meeting or you Zoom into a meeting and people, in your head, you think, I thought this was a marketing meeting. Why is sales here? Right? It's like, why is everyone like smushed in here together? Or the inverse. I thought this was a town hall. Why is it only managers in the room? Right? So really think about who needs to be there and why. And then the third is, open in a way that immediately gets everybody engaged and helps them see why they're all there. The Seder example is one, but now we're meeting, so many of us are meeting on Zoom. What if you opening the meeting with the purpose, but also to ask, if you have 30 people in your meeting or 100 or 1,000, we tend to underuse the chat, like the everyone chat. And I'm using Zoom kind of, writ large, whatever tech is your favorite.
Right.
To ask questions like, what is one thing in the last 24 hours that you did that, were not for COVID, you wouldn't be doing, right? Like give everybody a sense of what's everyone's context right now. Number 2, what is the most effective thing that you did as it relates to this project we're working on? I'm making it up, right? In the past week. Number 3, what's the biggest waste of time as it relates to this project? Right, that's also increasing the risk, and you're actually starting to create a culture where people say what it is they're thinking. But also with the chat box, one of the interesting elements of Zoom is that there's certain things that actually work better. Like to go around a circle of 30 people and ask everybody what they think takes 30 minutes. If you ask them to put into the chat and then you Zoom, you kind of scroll up and scroll down, that's a lot of data.
Yeah, sure. And you can get a sense of how everybody's showing up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's cool. So the chat feature is a way to reimagine the way we approach sort of, these virtual conversations. What else have you seen work? I mean, because we're living in this world right now, so many people, I'm trying to avoid people becoming Zoom zombies, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what else would you tell leaders, team members to do differently to drive connection?
So first is, and I know it sounds like a broken record, like every single time, do we need this meeting and why? And then defend it, right? It's like when you defend the purpose of a meeting, you're honoring people's time. Number 2, think about how you open. Gatherings begin not at the moment people enter the Zoom room or walk through the door. They open at the moment the guest discovers the meeting, which is usually through the invitation. So give your meeting a name. Don't just call it staff meeting. Like, is it a product reimagine meeting? Is it a death by 1,000 cuts meeting? Is it a what is this thing?
Sure.
Is it a brainstorming? Is it a review? Like to help people understand how they can show up to be successful. The third is like in every group, in every meeting, online or off, there are power dynamics. Power dynamics are not bad. They're simply ways in any moment a group allocates decision-making power. And in a Zoom context, power disproportionately lies in the mute button, right? Like who controls it? Is it on? Is it off?
Right, sure.
Right. And we tend to, in my experience, use it terribly. It's either blanket on or blanket off, or like it's on when it should be off and it's off when it should be on. So think about like, I do this for a lot of my meetings when I'm facilitating. We'll start with a blanket mute on. But have an opening slide as people are checking in. We'll have a question that people can then put into the chat. It could be something as simple as, what's one thing that somebody in your community did for you this past week that was a game changer, right? Like it depends on what the purpose is of what you want people to be thinking about. Or like, what do you like see out your window right now? Or what state are you in? People are moving so much right now with COVID. But then the second thing I do is I think, and I tell, and we create norms around the mute button. When is it going to be fully on? When is it going to be fully off?
Wow, okay.
When you mute all, the reason we do it is to avoid background noise. But you know what background noise has? Information, context, jokes, sarcastic comments, laughter, like mirroring. All of the things that help build conversation are actually the informal cues in our conversations. And so when you mute all, if there's a crying baby or a barking dog or somebody, loud construction, people can temporarily mute. But the biggest mistake leaders make is assume that the meeting has to be so tightly controlled that it becomes basically like a teleseminar to your colleagues. And so the biggest thing that I tell leaders is practice unmuting, but I'm giving you permission to create norms around what that means. So one of the norms I use in my meetings is unmuted but silent.
Right.
And what that means is we're all going to be on unmute. But then when, someone's talking, all of a sudden you hear people laughing or you hear people nodding. But if you have really loud background noise, then you mute temporarily. But a huge part of our conversation has become sterile and stilted because we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater when we mute everything.
Yep. Oh no, I've had moments that are absolutely hilarious, right? With pre-meeting, so you're right. I mean, that adds context and at some level it maybe keeps us all human, which is
Absolutely.
cool.
It's so important.
Totally. There's so much, I think, awesome advice in your book. I love your book. So I thought I'd go through some of the commonly asked questions, right? Right. Like an event planner is going to give, you logistic advice, but you're always going to challenge, the thinking so that maybe they go deeper in it. So, sort of the why are you coming together in the first place stuff. So often, right, event planners, what are the things that you think about, right? Who do I invite? What size? I want you to talk about that for a minute. How do I choose the venue? What should my role be? So imagine an event planner is listening. How would you reframe the way that they approach embarking on this gathering?
So the first thing is, don't assume that the purpose or the need that your event had before coronavirus is now the same need. So whether it's event planners or anybody else, we tend to get stuck to the form because in part it's easier, right? We have a formula. We know how it works. It's clockwork. There's going to be 3 speakers. It's going to go in this order. We just need to figure out the speakers. Then you pause and ask, well, why? Like, who is this for in the first place? So I will always say, start with purpose and ask, what is the need and who is my audience and what is the relationship I want among these guests, right? Am I asking people to be an audience? Am I asking them to be a critic? Am I asking them to participate like a dinner party guest? Am I asking them to imagine that they were like scrimmaging? This is just practice. Like the context that you set up your guests for really matters. And then the second is, size has power. I mean, both small and big. And so if you're wanting more of an intimate and honest conversation where people have more time to speak and be a relatively equal exchange, 6 is a great number, right? So like in church groups and religious groups, often like powers like prayer groups or small group peer groups or YPO groups, like 6 is a really good group number because it's big enough to still be kind of interesting. The risk is it can't really carry dead weight. Like if one person is checked out, everybody feels it.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
10 or 12 is better for a larger group. But, just in terms of group dynamics, we tend to, like if you walk into a room or you're on a Zoom, most of us don't calculate or don't think about what we're going to say based on the person in the room we most trust. We think about what we're willing to say in front of the person who we least trust or who we least know, right? So by who you're bringing together in a room absolutely will change the dynamics of what happens. I mean, unless everybody's there as like a muted audience and it's just a speaker, then it doesn't really matter. But if what you're wanting is some kind of exchange, groups have a life of their own. So choose your group wisely because it will affect the outcome.
Well, I know, and you talk about exclude with purpose, right? And being intentional about who not to include because of that dynamic. Tell me a little bit about that.
So I imagine you heard this growing up. I heard this growing up. The more, the merrier, right? Like there's always
Sure.
one more seat at my table. And all of that comes from a very good place, right? Which is a spirit of generosity. But we confuse the more, the merrier with what that's appropriate to. Like if you're having a big feast, traditionally, and whether it was in the Bible or whether it's kind of like Canterbury Tales or these kind of like traditional kind of tomes, it was to include like he or she who is most excluded. But that may be true for like a soccer game or a feast or a concert. But for many contexts, the more the merrier is not the more the merrier. It's the more the hairier or the more the scarier, which is like every single person who's coming in, if you, as a host, you need to take care of them and make sure that they're connected to the group. And so like very specific examples, if you are in a work context trying to reimagine a new relationship or sales channel or product, let's just take a product example. And you invite the lawyers in, right, to that first meeting, right? Like all of a sudden, because lawyers are very good and a legal eye to help you not think about risks are a very good use at a certain moment of a process. But at the very beginning, what you want is not risk aversion. What you want is like wild ideas.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Or alternatively, if you are having a birthday, I mean, going back to that example of the quitting party, she purposely excluded just for that event anybody in her life who was worried about her decision. Not because she didn't love them, not because she wasn't going to invite them to other stuff, but because they didn't fit the need, which was blowing courage her way. Right? So even if you think about a birthday party, rather than thinking, okay, I should just get the gang together this year. First of all, when we do that, every birthday, even if it's 1 year, every year starts to kind of feel the same. And if that's the purpose, if you want this like continued ritual with the same people and you see sort of the same thing each year, then do that by all means, but do it consciously. But otherwise, to ask, what is it that I need this year? And who might I bring together to be able to do that with? You know, I had a friend who was turning 50, and he realized that many of the people that he knows after 50 kind of go one or the other way. He said most of the people that he knew in their 60s or 70s started to make like less risky choices, started to like didn't meet new people as much, didn't move, like just kind of like more and more settled kind of into their ways. And there were some people, and he realized at the age of 50 that he wanted to continue to expand, not contract. And he invited people in his life to a dinner, like super simple, at his home. And at the beginning of the evening, he like done his glass. You'll hear a pattern in what I say. And he set context and he said, hey, and he said to them what I just said to you. And then he said, I invited you all here today because you're people in my life who have always represented expansion, and you've always helped me expand. And as I go into the next 50 years of my life, I hope that you'll always remind me to keep expanding when I get scared.
Wow. That's cool.
Right? And
Sure.
It was like 1 year. Did he do the same thing next year? No, he had a different need. So we are each evolving every year. And it's fun for it's so fun to get an invitation where like,
totally.
Right? Like somebody sees something in you that they want you to be witness to, and you meet other people who also carry that quality. And that's also how our culture begins to change.
I've had the opportunity to sit down with more than 100 leaders from all different backgrounds on this podcast, from CEOs to entrepreneurs to athletes, coaches, authors, you name it. So grateful. These conversations have challenged me. They've challenged me to think differently about leadership. So I came up with 7 mindset shifts that we can all make to reimagine our role as leaders. And to take it a step further, here's the thing. I also created a playbook of 7 exercises to accompany each mindset shift. Download it for free at mollyfletcher.com/mindset shifts. Again, that's mollyfletcher.com/mindset shifts. You know, you talked a little bit about how to best open, right? Meetings, parties, events, gatherings, even at your home or certainly meetings, whether it's Zoom or live. Tell me about closing. What should people be thinking about on how to close as well?
So we tend to slouch through our closings, right? Like at a conference, it could just simply be like, well, we end with logistics. Like, thank you so much to our sponsors. Right. Your, coat check is in the back. Like, see you all next year. Or like, you run out of time on the Zoom and say, thank you so much. Okay, bye guys. Bye. And in some contexts, it's fine, particularly for short gatherings or short meetings. But the larger or the more complex, or frankly, kind of the more of a world that you create in your gathering, whether it's, a costume party, or whether it's, virtual Burning Man just ended, or whether it's like a team meeting where you're choosing to have a heated discussion. The more important it is to spend time closing. Closing, the way I think about closings of any type of gathering is closing is the phase of meaning making. Like, what transpired here? What did we go through together? What do I think of this? What am I leaving? Like thinking differently. And one of the reasons why the artful gatherer spends time closing is because people are going to be making meaning whether or not like you want it.
Sure.
Right? It's like it's like after the wedding, like the debrief brunch the next day. Who hooked up with who? What was everyone wearing?
Sure.
And so for your gatherings, you want to spend time actually making meaning together in front of each other. And the more the more likely that people have different interpretations of something, of what transpired, the more important it is to close it. So say for like whether it's a family reunion or a college trip, or whether it's a group of peers or colleagues discussing something really controversial and people are starting to get upset, at the end to pause and say, what happened here? Like, what are you taking from this? What was a moment that led you to some amount of insight? And I do this as a conflict resolution facilitator in part because many of us are conflict averse. Sure. And so we think that if the tenor of or timbre of a meeting gets too hot, it's just knee-jerk bad. And that's not actually true. Like you can go into abusive territory, but most meetings don't get there. They can get tense. But tension can actually be helpful to get us somewhere, to get to some change, to get us to some transformation. And so at the very end to say, like, what did you hear here? What did you learn here? What did you witness here? And what are you thinking or feeling? And people, and almost always there'll be somebody in the group that says, actually, I think this is the most important conversation we've had to date. And that one person saying that can change everybody else's perception of what transpired here.
Sure. And so many people are scared, right, of conflict. And you say, which I love, right, introduce the heat. So how can people do this effectively inside of these moments? How can they introduce the heat, as you say, effectively?
So, part of my relationship to heat, if you will, also comes from the very beginning of our conversation, from my family upbringing. When my parents kind of announced that they were separating and then got divorced, I and all of their peer and communities were shocked. And we were shocked because they never fought. Mm-hmm. Right? It was a Cold War.
Right.
And I'm conflict averse. I was raised by two self-proclaimed ostriches. And I'm a conflict resolution facilitator who's like trying to figure out how to do this, even though when he comes into the room, I start my physiological reaction is to flee. And I've trained myself in part because I understand that so much of human connection is as threatened by unhealthy peace as by unhealthy conflict.
Very interesting. Sure.
And so I'm not saying like throw a bomb in there or try to just be a shit stirrer to wake people up. Borrowing from the great John Lewis, it's sort of, he talks about, cause good trouble. Like in a meeting context, it's like cause good controversy. And so what is good controversy? Good controversy, first of all, it's trusting the room and giving them the credit that they can handle it. It's preparing people so that whatever it is you're going to talk about, they feel respected and supported. But it's also just saying, what is it that we really need to talk about here? Who are we? What are our core values? And it doesn't always have to be so literal. So when I train people, one of the things I do is I help them understand, how do you train for relevance? How do you, as a conversationalist or as a leader, get to heat? And I give different examples. So like at a newspaper, right? The heat, there's a lot of sources of heat, but one of them is what goes on the homepage. Why? Because that's where the eyeballs are, right? Or what gets a notification, right? In this day and age, in a church or in a synagogue or in a temple, how are tithes being spent? So heat is related to relevance. What does a community care about? And how do we begin to have those conversations with care, but not avoid them?
So what advice would you give to somebody who's listening, who's like, man, but I just hate it when it gets so weird and tight and everybody gets anxious and, I hate those moments, right? Because so many people do, but I totally agree with you, right? If you do those things with intention, with kindness, with love, then it actually brings you closer together. What would you tell somebody that's feeling that way right now to do so that they could bring the heat because of the result that in turn it'll bring?
So the first, I would say a couple of things. One is one of the people I interviewed for The Art of Gathering is a woman named Ida Benedito, and she's a self-proclaimed transgression consultant, which basically means that she helps people navigate their own relationship to risk. And she would do things like, before COVID, host a fake convention at the Waldorf Astoria. And people would show up full suit and tie or dresses and heels and have to do things in a half an hour or an hour, there's a wedding on the third floor, crash it and give a toast to the bride. Right? These kind of not illegal, not immoral, but these risks. And she does this in part to help people realize that the things that scare them most of them aren't going to kill them.
Right.
And I asked her, what can the rest of us learn from you? And she says, whenever I'm wondering, whenever I design these experiences, and she works with teams as well, she asks 4 questions, and I love these questions, and so I'll pass them on to you. The first is, what is this group avoiding? The second is, what is the gift in helping them face it? The third is, what is the risk in helping them face it? And the fourth is the gift worth the risk? Part of all of this, particularly as a facilitator, is to have discretion, to have judgment, to say, what is it, what's going to actually serve the group? It's not heat for heat's sake. And then the second thing I say is, particularly if you're a leader, whatever or you have power in a specific group, in a team, in a family system, you're a parent, or in you're the eldest in an alumni association, whatever your conflict style is, and we all have conflict styles, and when you have disproportionate power in that group, your group is going to mirror that. Your conflict style is going to become the dominant culture of the group. So you should know what it is and begin to counter correct it, right? Is your tendency to fight or to flee? And whatever it is, it's okay. But part of that is just simply knowing it, what your conflict style is, and realizing oh God, we're avoiding these conversations because I'm not comfortable with them. Right. And so I know somebody who ran a team, and she was perceived and she was beloved because she was always a coach / cheerleader, deeply positive, and just got people to do things that they didn't think they could do. And her team was often afraid of bringing problems to her. And she started this very simple exercise where at the beginning of every of her staff meeting, once a week, she would say, everybody talk about their one rose and one thorn of the week. And she started doing this week after week, and people would bring all sorts of stuff. But some of it would be work-related, some of it would be personal, their own risk level. But one of the things that ended up happening first is it connected the group. But the second was it, over time, helped her team see that she could handle thorns. So again, I don't mean to say come in with a sledgehammer to your next meeting.
Sure.
But beginning to start to ascertain what is my conflict style, then also what are the conflict styles of the people in my team, and then how do we begin to ask the right questions to be able to have a conversation. And then the final thing is create ground rules around it. If something is really hot or really delicate, to say, hey, we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about it, we're going to limit it to 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And, if something hurts, no name calling, we're going to say, ouch, whatever, or bring in a facilitator, and then we're going to park it. And I think part of it is it's okay to create rules around things with a lot of heat, right? If anything, it helps us create these separate spaces where we can actually talk about the things that can be difficult.
Sure. And tell me this, somebody that's listening, that's I'm not in charge of the meetings that I'm going to, right? What role can they play in this? Because I would imagine there's people listening thinking maybe that at some level. And so what advice do you have for them?
So, I call this book The Art of Gathering and not The Art of Hosting, in part because I believe that guests have a lot of power. And I'll give a very simple example. I have 2 children. My eldest is a 5-year-old boy, and there's such a simple example. But we were at a social outdoor birthday party, and people kind of milling around and just kind of talking to one another, but weren't necessarily coming into the center of something. And he whispered in my ear, can I sing everyone a song? And he was a guest, he wasn't the birthday person. And I was surprised.
He wants to hijack the gathering at 5. Yeah, exactly. I like this kid.
Exactly. And he, I paused and I said to the other adults, he wants to sing a song. It's the birthday girl. Is that all right? And everyone in that moment was kind of that's so sweet. Sure. And they all gathered around and they looked at him, and he took a deep breath, and he kind of, paused, and he took another deep breath, and he paused, and he finally took another deep breath, and he started sort of singing the song he made up. And first of all, it had us all kind of come around. But then the second thing was another child came and said, I want to sing. And so then he passed it on to her, and she started singing. And then an older child who plays the guitar ran and got her guitar.
Wow.
And she came and sang. And it was this very simple, almost if you think about a canvas, he changed the color of the canvas. He introduced a new thread. And so there's a lot of power in the host, but there's also a lot of power in the guest. And sometimes hosts can't introduce things. Either it feels too hitting somebody over the head with it, or it feels like it's too much of, we actually, like, gatherings are social contracts between hosts and guests. And sometimes it can be a relief to have a guest suggest a different way, right? Or to have a guest suggest whatever it is. Like, that's a very simple example from our birthday party. But I know a lot of meetings I facilitate when a guest suggests, like, hey, can we do this in a breakout room? Or, hey, would you mind if we spend a little bit more time introducing each other? I feel so relieved because I know that there's demand for it.
Right, right. Well, and what's cool about what you're sharing too is that even with your son, you asked the host for permission. And just in those little examples you just rattled off, someone asked, hey, Priya, can we... So I'm also hearing you say maybe that you offer it up as a suggestion or an idea, and is it okay? You almost ask permission at some level too.
Yeah, or it's like, read the room. And I think in some contexts, if there's a huge power imbalance or something inappropriate's happening, I think then there are certain contexts you shouldn't ask for permission, right? You should walk out.
Yeah,
or you should, But I think what I'm saying is, like, guests have power. Don't abdicate your power as a guest.
You share, in my opinion, so many awesome stories in your book. Can you give our listeners like an example of a gathering in your own life that you've reimagined since writing the book and as a part of your journey in all of this, and maybe how?
One that was particularly meaningful to me was with a friend of mine. She's allowed me to to talk about this. It's a personal example. So she is an immigrant, and she's also bicultural, and her father is an immigrant to her, like, native country, right? So basically her father was Egyptian. She's half Egyptian, half German, and she now lives in the U.S. And her father passed away, and she went home for the funeral, and she came back, and I asked her, how are you doing? And she said, it was really beautiful to be there with my mother and to see kind of my childhood friends, but coming back, I still don't feel complete, that I've grieved him, and particularly that I've grieved him with my current life. And we talked about it, and she said, and I realized, and again, I, as a friend, was just kind of trying to get to the core of her need, right? Not like, okay, let's do this, or let's do this. Like, I wasn't trying to solve it. I was just first listening.
Sure.
And she said, if I think about it, you all know me as an entrepreneur, you know me as a wife, you know me as a mother, but you don't know a big part of me, which is as a daughter and as my father's daughter. And so long story short, we kind of made up a gathering, a ritual that was sort of part sitting Shiva, part tradition from a specific Muslim ritual. But basically what we did was, she said, we invited like 30 of her friends who are her current life, and in an email. Again, super simple. It doesn't have to be complicated invitations. Doesn't need to be paper. It doesn't need to be fancy.
Right.
She just said, like, what I just told you. And she said, I would love to be with you all on this evening. She gave us some structure, 6 to 9 p.m. Please arrive by 6:30 because we'll have the program will begin at 6:30. So she indicated, like, there's going to be some structure here. And people all came and wore black, and she sat, and she, for the first half an hour, shared, not even that long, she just shared the story of the life of her father. She showed us the photos of him, and she started telling us stories about him, and we started laughing at certain moments because we began to realize, like, oh my gosh, she's so her dad.
Oh, cool. Sure.
Right? Like, you could start to see the fingerprints of him on her. And then it was very beautiful because as she spoke, we each also thought of our parents, right? And the fingerprints on us. And then she paused and she said, if you have any advice or if anything you'd like to say, and there's this natural call and response. And then whoever felt like it kind of shared out what it was like when they lost their parents or a parent or a loved one, and what grief has been like. And then she closed it by playing like a morning prayer that he would listen to every morning in the shower. And then we broke bread and we ate. And it was so beautiful, in part because it was modern, right?
Sure,
it was made up.
Yeah, exactly.
When in history have we, so many of us, not lived in the town that we were born in? When in history have so many of us created a circle of friends that are like family? Like, when in history are so many of us transplants? And rather than just feeling lonely, she realized she needed her community. And again, she asked, what is the need here? And at first she thought, oh my gosh, is this really like selfish to do, but it was actually this huge act of generosity because, again, very simply, she was saying, I need you guys.
Yeah, that's so cool. Right. I mean, between the quitting party and sort of that story, right? I mean, it's really reimagining, right? The way that you gather and recognizing that it probably isn't the way it's always been. And that's okay, that there's so many gifts in that.
Because we are not the way we've always been.
Right on.
Right? Like
Amen.
More of us are, whether it's we're multicultural or multiracial or multireligious, or simply like, you know, where one parent is a Red Sox fan and the other parent is a Yankees fan.
Right.
We all have many things, and we're growing more diverse, a good thing. We're becoming more integrated, a good thing. We're like, there's a modern life. We're moving to different cities. And so a huge part of this is, rather than, again, throwing the baby out the bathwater, it's like, well, I guess I don't gather in that way anymore. I'm just going to stay at home, to begin to bring with fresh eyes, what is it that our communities need now? And how might we invent new ways of being together in a way that honors who we are, even if we're not the same?
And this is from personal perspective, Priya, just by the way, personally, this is very inspiring to me, right? Because I am far from Martha Stewart, right? Strapping on the apron and having on, the best food, but I can do these other things, right? So
absolutely. Me too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, cool. So, I want to hit you with rapid fire and close, but first, people who want more Priya in their lives, and I can't recommend this book enough, talk about your podcast, your newsletter, how people can stay connected to you.
Thank you. The first thing to continue the conversation is this spring, we launched a podcast called Together Apart with the New York Times, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts, Apple or Spotify or anywhere else. And, for a year, we had been working on a podcast that was supposed to be called Gathering with Priya Parker, where we had brides going in with voice memos on their cell phones, like recording the live sounds of their wedding and how they were shifting it, and nonprofits reimagining their fundraiser. And then COVID hit. And a producer texted me and said, a show called Gathering now sounds like a horror film.
Mm-hmm.
And we pivoted and we launched a weekly show because I realized that I was still getting emails and DMs and, tweets asking, like, how do we do this now? And so Together Apart is a podcast that explores that question, which is how in this time of coronavirus can we still be together apart? Whether it's a birthday party or a baby shower or a protest or a classroom. And so every week I talk to somebody around the country who's trying to figure out what to do, how to reimagine their classroom, or how to reimagine a protest, or how to reimagine their wedding. And so you can tune in there. And then I also have a bi-monthly newsletter, which folks can sign up for and share all types of different tips and inspirations. You can just find me at priyaparker.com or follow me on Instagram and sign up for the newsletter and to share your examples with me. I mean, so many of my examples come from others, right? I do believe courage is contagious, but also examples of like new forms, they can spread.
Yep. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. You've shared some awesome ones today, and you share them in your book, which is fantastic. So we end with rapid fire. So I'm going to hit you with a couple quick questions, and you just fire back what comes back.
Okay.
So introvert or extrovert?
Extrovert.
First job. What was your first job?
My first job was a babysitter.
What's your favorite book?
I would say currently the Ferrante novels.
Okay. The show's called Game Changers. So one last question. What game changer inspires you and why?
One game changer that inspires me is Monica Lewinsky. So she inspires me because I think she is somebody who, for decades, meant a very specific thing, was a butt of jokes, is 20 years later, still quoted daily in the news. And about 3 years ago, she, to me, very bravely came out in a TED Talk and spoke about what it was like to be kind of patient zero of bullying, and has since written very beautifully in Vanity Fair and columns about her navigating and separating herself as an individual from this symbol that she continues to represent, even if she chooses not to hold. And to me, watching her navigate her life, because she's still here, thank goodness.
Right.
To me, the way that she lives her life with integrity even when people want to put so much on what they think the symbol is that she holds, is, to me, game changing.
Mm-hmm. So I want to end our conversation by challenging myself with this question from your book. You talk about, what of this do I want to bring back to my other worlds, is how you say it. So, what I'm grabbing and taking away is the way to open and close my meetings, conversations, special moments with family and friends, and to recognize that we need to rethink the way and reimagine, the word you use, the way we gather, and at some level recognize the need and create the opportunity to connect in a way that could be very, very different than we ever imagined or have ever experienced before. You've given me a lot to think about, so thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the beautiful conversation and being so generous.
Wow. I don't know about you, but I'm already thinking about how I can apply what Priya shared to my next gathering. Our conversation was filled with practical and actionable advice. Here are 3 of my favorite takeaways. Number 1, the way we gather matters. This is the opening line in Priya's book, and it was one of my favorite takeaways because gathering shapes the way we think, feel, and make sense of the world. But most people spend very little time thinking about it with any intention. And as a result, we end up stuck in underwhelming gatherings that fail to capture us, change us, or connect us in any meaningful way. Priya challenged me to think differently about how we gather and why it matters. Number 2, think about how you open. The first 5% of any experience lays the foundation for the rest of it. One small but powerful takeaway I wrote down, because I can be guilty of this myself, is to never start a meeting with housekeeping. Or as Priya says in her book, never start a funeral with logistics. And number 3, bring a little heat. As a trained conflict resolution facilitator, Priya knows the power of what she calls good controversy. So as you sit down for Thanksgiving dinner with your family, just remember, a little heat can add both energy and life to your gatherings. In avoiding it, we waste countless opportunities to truly connect. Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.